Yo, what up? Back with another comic book related video, and today we are going to discuss the new Aquaman movie, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And by thoroughly enjoyed, I don't want to be vague here. I mean, I legitimately feel that it is one of the better comic book movies to ever have existed. And I know there are going to be many reviews of the movie from these movie buffs, but I want to take a different approach, right? I'll sort of review the movie, but I like to tie in some comparing and contrasting between the movie and the actual comics. So there are going to be some slight spoilers, so do not watch this video unless you've already seen the movie or you don't plan on seeing it at all, or you don't care about spoilers. First things first though, let me start by saying this. And it's so annoying that I have to even mention this because the Marvel Cinematic Universe is so dominant right now. Any comic book movie that drops will be compared to it harshly by either Marvel stans or people that only half-ass enjoy comics, and by that I'm referring to those that only loosely know about the comics. They just know of the characters due to maybe cartoons and live action depictions. These people have already made up their minds before the movie ever dropped, and they are probably already typing right now. And to you, I say, shut the fuck up. I'm a fan of both Marvel and DC, and have been my entire life. Believe it or not, it is possible to look at them independently. The scale of what is good is not measured by what one company does over the other. Both can do something good, they can do something that's bad or mediocre. I remember posting about this movie, and one of the first comments was someone saying, "There's no way this is better than Into the Spider-Verse movie." What the fuck does that have to do with anything? Completely different characters, completely different movie types. The only thing they share in common is that they are based off of comic book characters. That's it. But it goes to show, again, how these Marvel stans and half-ass fans can't objectively review anything without immediate comparison or bias. And if you do that in the comments, you may get grilled if I happen to be bored, and I'm probably going to end up calling your bluff. The positive thing about the live action depictions of these comic book characters, and they're being so popular right now. The positive thing is that it's introduced so many people to the worlds of these characters, and it has brought so many characters to life for longtime fans like myself. But the negative is that it's attracted the snobbiness and elitism of Hollywood and its reviewers, which to me has also stained the comic book communities in many different ways. I'm not a DC guy, I'm not a Marvel guy. I'm a DC and a Marvel guy, and just like with the comics, unless it looks outrageous, I will see, the movie or show for myself, reviewing it objectively. I will never take a review, especially on a movie, to heart without seeing it for myself. And I highly advise that you go do the same. Don't take people's word for it, including mine. Go see it for yourself. Well, with that being said, let's get into it and let's talk about the movie itself. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to reel in the comics, but the movie to me was incredible. Jason Moore plays an incredible Aquaman, and Amber Heard played a great Mera. The movie is almost 2.5 hours long, but the pacing of it is great. I actually love the fact that they make these longer movies because they have to build these characters who have these documented histories. Certainly if it's like their first time in these live action depictions. If you don't have multiple movies to really do that, it is incredibly difficult to do it and make sense of it all. So in the first portion of the movie, they discuss how Atlanna, who was the queen of Atlantis, she washed up on shore, and a lighthouse keeper by the name of Thomas, saves her, falls in love with her, and has a baby by the name of Arthur, who is Aquaman, a half-breed of both underwater world and the surface dwellers. Now, of course, Atlanna defies the kingdom by doing such a thing, so they send crews to attack her, and we get to see this badass fight scene between Atlanna and those crews. Now, one of the things I've always enjoyed about the recent DC films are the fight scenes. It was very similar with the recent Superman movie, in which they are like intimate fight scenes that truly capture the power and the abilities of these characters. Nonetheless, Atlanna says that she has to leave little Arthur and his father because they will not stop coming for her. In the beginning, we also get to see a scene where Aquaman saves a submarine that was jacked by these pirates. the main being a father and son. At first, the pirates seem successful, and there's a scene where the father gives his son a knife that was given to him by his father, who was once referred to as a manta, go figure. But as Aquaman saves all of the ship members, the father gets trapped. And Aquaman could save him, but doesn't because, well, they have killed so many innocent people. So the father dies, and the son, David, vows revenge, and in short, eventually becomes Black Manta. Right off the rip, we are seeing just how powerful Aquaman is, which is greatly appreciated. Example, by himself, underwater, Aquaman pushed this massive submarine, this is huge, all the way up to the top of the ocean. He also gets hit point blank with a friggin' grenade launcher right in his chest, and he easily survives it. And during this whole time, he had been kicking his pirate's ass like it was nothing. So you can see really how much stronger he is than just Joe Blow surface dwellers, as he should be. And they are showing Aquaman love that he deserves regarding his power. Anyway, throughout the movie, you know, we see flashbacks and cool scenes of Arthur learning about his power and training with Vulko, who promised his mother that he would sort of watch over him. It wasn't until Aquaman was a teenager when he found out that his mother is supposedly dead, fed to the trenches because the king found out about the half-breed son. The whole narrative of this movie is centered around just that. Atlanna also had another kid with the king by the name of Orm. Orm has a vendetta against the surface dwellers and blames Aquaman for having his mom killed. So now ruler of Atlantis, he works with Black Manta to stage an attack at the very moment he's visiting these other underwater kingdoms and attempting to really convince them to align so they can wage war on the surface dwellers. Now basically, it was a fake attack that would sway the King of Zabel to join in on the attack so they can convince the other kingdoms. And this is where Mera and Vulko come into play. Now, Mera is the daughter of the King of Zabel, who was really raised by Atlanna, basically groomed to become the king, right? And her and Aquaman's mentor, Vulko, do not want this war to happen, obviously, so they are trying to convince Aquaman to become king so the war is avoided. Now, Aquaman is at first reluctant as Orm sent warnings really across the world, one of which almost got his father killed. He decided to join in after that, Aquaman that is. The idea is that they need to go and collect the Trident of Atlan, which is a trident once owned by the first king of Atlantis, and that will cement Aquaman's position as king. So he has two adversaries to deal with, Black Manta and Orm, aka Ocean Master, who happen to be working together, by the way. Now, Black Manta becomes Black Manta by using the equipment given to him by Orm. So much of the movie is really centered around the conflicts between these characters as Aquaman and Mera are on the journey to go find that trident. They are, of course, becoming more fond of each other. The dynamic between these two is awesome because their power is not limited. Mera is not some helpless, Atlantean. She, in fact, saves Aquaman's ass multiple times, and she's also ridiculously strong. And their power isn't exactly the same. She isn't just a female Aquaman. Aquaman seems to have more like brute strength on display, as Mera has a much better grasp in terms of like manipulating liquid. The contrast between their powers make for a good duo. Now, another thing that I like is how, as they should, both characters aren't useless on land. Both still are way stronger than the humans on land. But there's a cool scene where Mera, for example, pulls like sweat from Aquaman's head because they needed that as a water source. She also weaponized a bunch of bottles of wine. Now, they also, jumped out of a flying plane at one time without any sort of parachute and hit the ground uninjured. I want to get to these comics, so let's speed through this. Orm is getting rather successful in uniting these nations, some by force, so he has a big army that's becoming who we know him as in the comics, Ocean Master. Mera and Aquaman journey to, again, get that trident of Atlan. On the way, they defeat Black Manta and encounter the Trenches, which are these mythical beasts that Atlanna, Aquaman's mother, was fed to, supposedly. And boy, there's a lot of them. Nonetheless, they work their way through all of that. Get to that hidden sea near the core of the earth, and that's where the trident is. And they find that Atlanna, Aquaman's mother is still alive. She says that she hasn't come back because the only way back is with that trident, and that can only be, really obtained by the true king, as a mythical beast known as the Keratin guards it. It's huge. So Aquaman steps up and is able to communicate with the beast, which no one is able to do. Again, that's Aquaman's ability to talk to animals. That's really unique, or communicate with those animals is really unique to him, because not all underwater dwellers, if you will, can really do that. But Aquaman clearly is the chosen one. He gets the trident from the hands of the dead king. He then gets the classic orange and green suit, looking more like Aquaman of the comics, so they go to interrupt Ocean Master as he's fighting the last underwater kingdom that refuses to work with him. Aquaman then shows up, now partnered with a massive beast that protected that trident, and eventually he defeats Ocean Master, thus becoming the king. Also, we see Atlanta reunite with Aquaman's father, who had been walking to the end of the lighthouse, hoping that she'd show up every day since they parted ways. I cannot say enough how much I thoroughly enjoy the storyline of this movie, the pace and the visuals and combat. Like, Aquaman is such a difficult character to depict in live action because he's best suited in being underwater. This film uses that uniqueness to its advantage, and you can even see the contrast between them sort of operating on land versus in the ocean. This isn't like on some SpongeBob stuff where they just move about like in the water, like they're not in water, like people on land, and there's really just an overlay of water. Nah, from the way they swim about and use the water as a tool to mingle with the animals and so forth, it makes for such a cool and different and unique visual. When they are underwater, it's obvious that they are underwater, and it is visually ambitious in that regard. This movie, of course, gets an A from me, and is excellent from top to bottom. I don't say this as a biased DC fan or someone paid to do these stupid reviews. I say this as a fan of comics and action movies. But let's get into the good stuff and talk about how this relates to the actual comic book characters, as this, after all, is based on them. Aquaman is a classic comic book character that has existed since the friggin' 1940s. Considering this, it is understandable how the character has changed with the times, as this comic has become more prominent, or comics in general have become more prominent. As decades progressed in the comics, he became way more powerful. Though he is still largely kept that sort of same base as a humanoid, primarily in water, that has connections to Atlantis. We've seen this origin story slightly change as well throughout the years, but some of the earlier cartoon depictions did not do this character any justice, and that's why he became the butt of a lot of jokes in pop culture, as if he's like this corny fish character, namely like the Superman and Aquaman hour of adventure in the 60s, and the Super Friends in the 70s and the 80s. It wasn't really until the 90s and beyond where he was making guest appearances in like Superman and Batman and Justice League tunes, where he was more of like an alpha. And, but really before that, he was already like a powerful comic book character. And especially now, it's pretty clear that you want to remain on the good side of Aquaman. This character saw notable changes starting in the 1960s, and then it all came together in the DC New 52 revamps. Near the 60s, when he got his own headlining comic, his backstory became more like it was in the movie. That is, Thomas and Atlanta being his parents, and him being a half-breed. And though he showcases great power in water, he's not as strong as we know him today. He actually had a downgrade in terms of power on land, as seen here in Aquaman issue 44. He is captured by mere humans and tied up by a rope, and is freaking out. This is because he now can only stay out of water for an hour at a time. Newer Aquaman would never be in this position, and even the first depicted Aquaman had no issues breathing on both land and in water. The more important thing to note is that in this series is where we met the iconic figures that are part of this film: his lover Mera, his brother, or more so half-brother, and his enemy Ocean Master, as well as Black Manta, and they were all introduced in this series, which originated in 1962. The character is developed through the 70s and the 80s, and this is where we start to get a tad more dark and more complex. And we get the classic storylines such as when he and Mera have a baby, which Black Manta ends up suffocating. Now, me personally, I thought the late 80s depictions were rather odd and out of place. I get it though, they were trying to rebuild this character. They gave him a completely different color suit and everything at one point, but Aquaman's power does become more notable. Going into the 90s is where Aquaman starts to look a little more like he does in the film. In 1993, the 4-part issue of Time and Tide drops, and he has longer hair. But they do make some changes to his origin, which is a little weird. In this series, upon reading the Atlantis Chronicles, he finds out that his father is not the surface dweller his mother encountered, but instead by a centuries-old, Atlantean wizard. So he comes from a long line of insane monsters that just happen to have long blonde hair like he has now. His original name isn't Arthur, it's Orin. When he was a baby, he was randomly discovered by a dolphin by the name of Poem that brought him along with his posse and was greatly criticized by his clique. They were confused as to why he brought this random baby along, but Poem just felt that he was special. By 18 months, Aquaman could swim without help. As a baby, he thought he was a for real dolphin. One day, he was being taught to hunt fish by a female dolphin by the name of Nira before they are attacked by a shark that ends up getting a hold of her. Now, baby Aquaman snaps off a piece of coral instinctively and starts slamming the shark's nose. Then he pokes him in the eye with it. Again, this is an 18-year-old baby, but Aquaman grows into a boy, and aside from the weird encounter where he says he's attracted to this female dolphin, we get to see his humanity. His dolphin brother gets killed by surface dwellers, and his dolphin mom says, well, leave him to die. Aquaman says that may be their way, but that's not his way. Sharks eventually eat his dolphin brother, but that is where Aquaman begins to find his own way. So basically in this series, it deals with the past of Aquaman, but after having had all of these experiences, such as having a kid with Mira. He has basically gone mad by the end of this series, and it's a very short series, I must add. But the character is more mature, he's darker and more rugged. There's also no real mention of Thomas, the lighthouse keeper, who has usually been depicted as his father. In 1991, there was a brief series, and by 1994, the new Aquaman launches, and DC has made it clear that they are dedicated to building this version of the character, as this ends up being a 75-issue long series, which is the second longest Aquaman series, only trailing the original headliner that popped off in the 1960s. So no more of these one-offs or just strictly guest appearances with the Justice League. Aquaman now looks more like he does in the film. Long hair and a beard. They are so committed to these changes and changing his appearance that they have the villain Charybdis place his hand in a pool of piranhas, and they literally eat his hand off in the second issue. So this Aquaman is more of an adult geared comic, and there's blood and guts, all of that good stuff. Now early on there are some familiar characters such as Aqualad and Volko, but again, remember this takes place with an already established, much older Aquaman. The character Dolphin is also treated as a bit of his love interest and sidekick. That is until Mira comes back. In fact, Aqualad becomes Tempest and then falls in love with Dolphin, and they have a child. Yes, a lot goes on in this series. Also, Aquaman has another son by the name of Koryak that he had illegitimately with a Northern Canadian. Now let's talk about Mira. It is in this series where she becomes the badass she sort of is in the film. Don't get me wrong, in previous depictions, she does fight. She's a queen. She can be a warrior here and there, but she's far more darker and far more powerful than previously. Anyway, Mira randomly shows up in the bedroom of Aquaman and Dolphin, and of course they get to fight, and apparently she doesn't remember leaving and never wanting to see him again. But then she snaps into this mode and punches him, saying he killed her son. So she's not herself and has been in another world married to Thanatos, who is a former villain of Aquaman, and she also has a kid with him. Anyway, throughout this series, she ends up fighting alongside Aquaman a lot. She is no chump. Back to Aquaman. Getting a gauge of how strong this guy is, in issue 16, Aquaman gets investigated by the Justice League, and ends up fighting them because he doesn't like them snooping around. He ends up holding his own with folks like friggin' Martian Manhunter. But by issue 31, Aquaman now has green skin and webbed hands due to a result of a fight with the shark. Aquaman has some crazy lineage that the Thing helps him realize, which sends him on a vision quest. This quest starts in issue 33 that drops Aquaman in a sandy area, which is very similar to what happened to him and Mera in the movie. He actually sees a ghostly version of Mera during this vision. And in this vision, he also sees Atlan, who is just the first king of Atlantis in the film, but in this depiction, he is his father. We also see another king ancestor by the name of Orin, which of course is Aquaman's real name. Basically, this vision is a huge trip, and Aquaman learns more about his past. He's destined to be king, and his blonde hair comes from being a descendant of a being known as Kordax, who was green and could communicate with other animals. But he also set off a civil war. His realization of this cleansed him and brought him back with his regular skin. By the way, a lot of this is covered in the Atlantis Chronicles that popped up in 1990, which I'll mention a little later. So 1994 Aquaman is seasoned, bearded, mature, powerful, and not named Arthur. This is certainly a culmination of previous origins, but just in a new direction, I guess. A more brutal, darker direction. Also in the 90s, he does appear in the JLA comics with much of the same characteristics, but they do call him Arthur. It's funny because though he does appear, he's clearly more focused on being the king of the sea rather than just being a member of the Justice League. In this strip, for example, he's catching an attitude with Wonder Woman. I personally believe that the early 90s depiction of Aquaman is the Aquaman, and it is the foundation for Aquaman to come. So fast forwarding to 2002, another Aquaman series drops that lasts about 50 issues or so. But it's really weird because there's a lot of tie-ins and odd things going on with the DC universe, such as Identity Crisis and the Infinite Crisis, which were really popular at the time. Now, in short, yet again, this is another season to Aquaman, but he's been banished from Atlantis. A part of San Diego sinks into the ocean, becomes Sub-Diego, they call it, and that's where he resides. But after Infinite Crisis, Aquaman disappears with a new Aquaman by the name of Arthur Joseph Curry, and he takes over as Aquaman. This Arthur can breathe underwater and has gills due to an emergency experiment after he is born in a storm. He's raised in a friggin' tank and can't breathe above water, but during another storm, when he's older, he falls into the ocean and then is hit up by a mysterious creature known as the Dweller in the Depths, who is telepathic. Basically, the Dweller says by prophecy, Arthur will become the second Aquaman. So this part of the series is known as the Sword of Atlantis and does have some familiar names, but not the same backstory. For example, Arthur Joseph does have connections to a lighthouse keeper named Tom, but it's his uncle. So it becomes apparent that the Dweller of the Depths is Orin, the original Aquaman, that does not remember of his past, only enough to attempt to try to project his past onto Arthur Joseph. In issue 50, he is eventually killed by someone named Narwhal, who is actually Koryak with a wiped memory. Remember, Koryak is the son of Orin when he shacked with that North Canadian, which you can read about in Aquaman Time and Tide, which we briefly went over. He was instructed to kill the Dweller, who didn't know he was Orin, by the Deep Church because Orin has to die for a god called Urlok to be restored. The main thing to take from this Aquaman, which started in 2002, is that there are two Aquaman. And since the original origin was ditched, they brought a new Aquaman, which has some familiar references to the one of the old, which is indicative by his name, Arthur Joseph Curry. Now, not to spend too much time on this era, but in the series 52, it is explained how Aquaman became the Dweller. He was trying to save Sub-Diego, the sunken part of San Diego, and made a deal with two gods, Poseidon and Triton, which gives him these new powers, but it also transformed him and he forgot who he was. He is later, however, revived by the Black Lanterns, then cleansed and fully restored by the White Lanterns. Long story. So Aquaman is back alive and he looks rather young again. But quite frankly, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because if you read Brightest Day issue 16, as he's talking to the Black Manta's son, he adopts the old Arthur Curry's backstory. He's not Orin. He's again the half-human, half-Atlantean son of Atlanta and Tom Curry. Doesn't make sense, but it's comics and they can do things like that. I will say that this revived version of Aquaman gets back to the roots and is referenced from the film, much as Mera being from Zabel and defying her people by allying Aquaman, things like that. Aquaman, of course, gets his own series with the new reboot of the New 52 and then in Rebirth. Before I go all the way into his origin, I think the first issue of the New 52 reboot is important because the writers are acknowledging that Aquaman has been the butt of a lot of jokes. They are blunt with it. In this strip, a wannabe reporter actually asked him what it's like to be nobody's favorite hero, even bringing up Saturday Night Live skits and the jokes played on him. So it seems like the writers are trying to emphasize that he's much more than these jokes. Nonetheless, it is quite obvious that this depiction in terms of story is the most like the movie. What is known as issue number 0 in the New 52 version, it takes place 6 years before people knew Aquaman as he is now. His father dies and his final wish is for him, Arthur, to finally go to find his mother in Atlantis. You get to see a glimpse of a young Aquaman's power. He's lifting ships, beating up sharks, and communicating with them. After seeing a ship that was about to crash when he was out on journey to find Atlantis, one of the men on the ship say that there's an old rumor about a guy by the name of Vulko who also claimed that he was from Atlantis when he appeared like 10 years ago. He apparently lives in Norway. So he visits him, and Vulko is so happy because, quote, the Queen's son is alive. Vulko tells him that he used to be the advisor to the Atlantean throne, which is who he is in the movie. And he explains to him that his mother died a long time ago. He tells Arthur that she met his father when she saved him, so not like the other way around, like he discovered her like in the movie, and they fell in love. When she found out she was pregnant, she went back to Atlantis and tried to be released from her throne so she could be with his father. But she was thrown in jail, only to escape and birth Arthur, only to leave him with her father because she knew they wouldn't stop coming for her. Again, this is very similar to what happened in the movie. When she returned, she was forced to marry an Atlantean guard. This is how she had Orm. And when he was 12, Orm's father was killed. And she saw this as an opportunity to get back. And Vulko tried to help her, but she was killed the night before she left. It is believed that Orm was the one that killed her, and he became the king of Atlantis. And Vulko is no longer there because he accused Orm of the murder and they tried to then kill him. So it gives Arthur a map to the king's armory to find the dead king's indestructible trident, which is the most powerful Atlantean artifact. Vulko tells him that he's the descendant of this king and the rightful heir. By law, the eldest son of the queen is the king of Atlantis. So this is very similar to the setup to the movie. The difference is that Vulko is no longer in Atlantis, but the idea is still the same regarding Aquaman having to come take his place as the rightful ruler of Atlantis after obtaining this great trident. So the New 52 issue 1 takes place after Aquaman became the king, ruled, and then left. So him and Mera live on the lighthouse together, having trouble adjusting to life as they are both greatly underestimated. That is until the trench appears on the surface and they have to save everybody's ass. What I love about this is that we see both Aquaman and Mera kicking all sorts of ass, and Mera is depicting as a warrior. In some sense, she's actually more cutthroat than Aquaman is, but much like the movie, he's more like physical, more brute than she is, as she seems to be able to like command water more than Aquaman does, or at least she chooses to. Anyway, we know in the film they have conflict with the trench and they fight off a lot of them, just like they do here. In this film, however, Orm is a ruler of Atlantis. This is like the Throne of Atlantis arc, which starts by issue number 14. Black Manta is also in this arc. He, by this point, is already an adversary to Aquaman and is being held up by Waller and her men. Agent Waller is the woman responsible for, of course, the Suicide Squad. She wants Black Manta to join, but he says he only dies for Aquaman. Now, Black Manta does hate Aquaman, but we'll cover that in a few minutes, why that is the case. In this issue, we move on to Aquaman confronting Orm, who is now king, and Aquaman asks him if he has plans to attack the surface dwellers. This is due to a result of a few different events, one being Black Manta attacking a US military base to get an Atlantean artifact. Aquaman suspects that Orm could be the Atlantean that hired Black Manta to get the artifacts. Of course, Orm denies this, but in the film he does pay Black Manta to attack in order to really incentivize this war. On the next issue of the Throne of Atlantis arc, Gotham is flooded and Aquaman and Mera help to save as many citizens as they can, but many do die. This is basically Orm attacking surface dwellers. We see the same thing happening in Metropolis, where we see Wonder Woman and Superman standing over Vulko, who wakes up asking, "Where's King Arthur?" To get a glimpse at how strong these Atlanteans can be, Vulko punches Superman into a wall because he doesn't think, he really understands how urgent this is. Mera is tasked to clean up Gotham, and again, getting a glimpse of her power, she is moving entire bodies of water. But there's an important conversation taking place between Batman and Aquaman. Aquaman talks about how him first, really getting to Atlantis and being welcomed with open arms. He didn't have to fight Orm. He stepped down and gave him the throne, and there was conflict among the Atlanteans because they felt him to be an impure king. He's a half-breed, so Aquaman became the king they wanted him to be, and in this process he came up with the warlike creeds that Orm is supposedly following as he's sinking cities. These plans were devised by Aquaman himself, and that's why they are aimed at these cities like Metropolis and Gotham, because he knows that folks like Batman and Superman would be a threat in the event of a war. Moving forward, they all reunite with Vulko, who says that someone targeted Atlantis because they wanted to start this war. Everybody else other than Batman is ready to bring Orm in, but Aquaman wants a chance to bring him in peacefully, and Batman grants this. By the way, just like nearly every depiction of the Justice League, Aquaman is a founding member. So Orm rises from the waters and is met by Aquaman, where they have a brief conversation about the events that led to this. Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman show up, and they don't think this is being handled, and this issue ends with Aquaman saying that his hand was forced, with his hand around Batman's neck. We begin the next issue with members of the Justice League in pods after being banished by Orm in the bottom of the ocean. Aquaman breaks out of his and advises that Batman stays in his because he can't handle the pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Basically, they've been sent to be eaten alive by the trench. This is a similar custom to that of what happened in the film when Atlanta was banished. While they're at the bottom of the ocean, Hawkman, Firestorm, Black Canary, Vixen, Black Lightning, and others are fighting the Atlanteans. These are basically the Justice League reserves, and they were all summoned by Cyborg. Cyborg gets some upgrades so he can survive underwater, and because Batman sent a signal, he knows exactly where he is. So he joins Mera, and they head to the bottom of the ocean. And they arrive just in time because as Aquaman, carrying Batman's pod, finds the pods of Superman and Wonder Woman, and the trench began to attack. So obviously they needed all the help they can get, and they were able to fight them off. And now they're swimming back to the top, and along the way they get the security footage that started this whole war, and it turns out that it wasn't Orm that popped this off, it was Vulko. Vulko wanted them to fight in hopes that Aquaman will return to being the king. He also has an ancient artifact that allows him to control the trench, that of which everybody thought Orm had. So if you piece together some of the points in the New 52 version of Aquaman, you basically get the film. The film is more of a combination of things that happen in the New 52, which are expanded ideas of many things that happened in previous depictions of the character. Last thing I want to mention is that there's a secret origins issue that talks about the background of Arthur. Same old usual, born of Atlanta and Tom, but it goes in depth on some of the things that popped off with young Arthur. When he was young, Dr. Shin was a scientist that was brought in by Tom to help him, understand Arthur, help him out and whatnot. He was ready to reveal all of his work to the public. That was part of a deal that Tom and Dr. Shin made, but Tom then goes on to destroy all of his equipment. But it is around this time that young Arthur revealed his power by pushing a frigging plane out of the water. In this issue, we also learn more about how Shin paid a man to get a blood sample. Remember, all of his stuff is destroyed, and which Aquaman then shows up to save his dad from that man that went to get the sample, and this is how his dad has that heart attack. Going on a rampage, he tracks down the man that is responsible for his dad's heart attack and cracks his neck, thus killing him. But it is the wrong man. It was the father of the man who was paid by Shin, who is the Black Manta. Now, Shin is the guy that shows up in the mid-credits of the movie saving Black Manta. That seemed to be sort of the connection between the two by the film. So I've referenced some comic arcs so you can really get a glimpse where some of the ideas originated. All of the main characters in the film are depicted in some way, shape, or form. The main characters, that is, in the comics. Now, the only thing I really didn't go into a whole lot of detail about is like those underwater nations that's referenced in the films. Like Atlantis used to be like above water, then it went underwater and they adapted, and Atlan was the first king of Atlantis, and then he exiles themselves to really just die with the trident, 7 nations, yada yada yada. Though some of this seems to be a loose reference to the Atlantis Chronicles, it was also pulled from the New 52 version. New 52 version does have Atlan in it, who appears as Dead King, and they talk about his history in issue 24. Now, Arthur learns that being king wasn't exactly his birthright. We learn that Atlan was the king and architect of the nation of Atlantis. He was a peaceful king, tolerant of outsiders, but his brother Orin thinks that this will eradicate their people, so he jacks the throne. Atlan instructs his wife, Sala, and his child to leave as he fights Orin and his men. But once he flees the fight to link back up with them, he realizes that they are killed. So he hides for years and forges the artifacts of Atlantis, which are 6 powerful talismans. He then returns to Atlantis, kills the brother and her queen, and then sinks all of Atlantis, which kills like 90% of the population. There once was a total of 7 kingdoms on Atlantis, but only 3 survived, and those survivors then evolved. So you have the Trench, you have like the Atlanteans, and Zabel, which is where Mera is from. So it turns out that Aquaman is not the descendant of Atlan, but instead the descendant of Orin. So again, that name Orin is back. But that's gonna do it for this video. The takeaway, the movie was great. It takes like the look of the 1994 Aquaman, which is Orin, and much of like the story from the New 52 depiction of him, which is basically a combination of a lot of like historical arcs, but it's rooted in the classic depiction of Arthur Curry, son of Atlanta, and Tom Curry. He's a lot stronger than what a lot of people assume, and his power, he's not just able to communicate with fish, right? Though that is unique to him. I think everyone knows that the trident that he usually carries can do a lot of different things, lightning bolts, all kinds of things. But on top of his bulletproof skin and superhuman strength, he has other crazy things going on, especially when he gets the blessing of the god of Poseidon. It seems that as the character grows and grows and grows, he gets stronger and stronger and stronger. Y'all better start putting respect on Aquaman's name.